They're pretty hot. Green light. All right, let's get started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thank you so much for coming out to tonight's program. Thank you for tuning in if you're watching with us live online. We've got a very special program for you tonight. We have just a whole stage full of brilliant people, not including myself, of course. My name is Chris Smith. I work here at the Museum of Natural Sciences as the coordinator for current science programs. That job title means that I get the pleasure and privilege of welcoming everybody into the museum. It also means that I get to meet really interesting people who are doing interesting work out there in the realms of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, art as it relates to science, education, and even more. And so it's always a thrill to be here in the museum talking about science or nature, or conservation, or any of those great and fabulous topics that make this museum such a great resource and such a great place to be. To my left, you can see these are the brilliant people that I've been joined with tonight. First, I want to introduce Dr. Mike Cove, closest to me. Oh, yay! Yeah, we can clap for Dr. Cove. Mike serves as the research curator for mammalogy here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. He is an expert on rats, but I guess a particular type of rat. Actually, you know what? I'm going to say he knows a whole lot about a whole lot of mammals. We had an event not too long ago here at the museum, and the audience was peppering Dr. Cove here with questions about all types of different animals from all regions of the planet, and he, right at the top of his mind, incredible answers to great questions from rats that live in the Appalachian Mountains to capybaras in South America. It was a great talk. So thanks for being here, Mike.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about pests.
And then across the way, we have Dr. Roland Kays. Roland serves as the head of the Biodiversity Research Lab here at the museum. His glass-walled research lab is over in the Nature Research Center. He's also a professor at North Carolina State University, teaching zoology and an expert zoologist. But Dr. Kays is particularly skilled in the realms of animal tracking. Maybe not so much just like sniffing animal tracks in the forest and knowing which way they went, although I would believe that you're very good at that as well.
I mean, if there's snow, I can do it.
That's perfect. But also using more technology and modern techniques of animal trapping, particularly things like camera traps and GPS tracking.
Great. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Roland. And then, of course, the reason that all the three of us here, and the reason we're here at the museum tonight, is to hear about the new book, Pests, How Humans Create Animal Villains. And tonight we have a very special guest, Dr. Bethany Brookshire. Bethany is a science journalist. You could read Bethany's work in the Washington Post, New York Times, Slate, The Atlantic, and then, of course, places like Scientific American, Science News, was a former staff writer for Science News for Students, which I actually scrolled through the archive, and just like so many things that I need to learn about in the archive there. So I'm going to go be a student at Science News for Students. And we're very excited that we have experts in animals that some people consider pests here at the museum, and Bethany, that you could be with us to talk about your new book and share with us some of the cool science and stories that you investigated. So let's get to it. If you could, I'm going to take a seat. Thank you for letting me join tonight's conversation as well.
I'm just testing this. It is not working. Are you sure? Oh, you need to hold it? Sorry. Hi. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you. Technology is not my thing.
Give it to the tracking guy. We'll figure it out.
Okay, thank you. Please fix this camera trap.
So, okay, let's get started. I guess the best place to start is, Bethany, tell us about the book. What's the sales pitch for Pests?
Yeah, so I started researching this book all the way back in 2016 when the idea first happened. But I have become obsessed with pests because what is a pest, right? When you really think hard about it, a pest is an animal that makes you mad. It's an animal that pisses you off. And that means that a pest has nothing to do with what the animal is, where it's going, what it's doing, and it has everything to do with you and what you think your environment should be like. Who should be in it? Who belongs near you with your stuff, etc. And so I just became fascinated by this concept of pests. And I also realized that almost everyone you talk to when you talk to them about pests, everybody has a pest story. So my personal pest story, which is featured in the book, involves, can I cuss here?
Sure.
I don't know.
You're the boss.
I think
C-SPAN, can I cuss? Can I get a... Okay, that looks like a thumbs up. All right,
I think
cool.
the three of us work for the state of North Carolina, but you do not.
I do not. Okay, good. The squirrel that I am talking about, his name is fucking Kevin. We call him Kevin for short and because a 3-year-old lives next door. But fucking Kevin is an eastern gray squirrel, otherwise known as Sciurius carolinensis. And Kevin lives in my yard, and I hate him so much. This Kevin, this squirrel, we now call all squirrels Kevin in my house. So we'll just be walking around and being like, oh, that's a Kevin. This squirrel is the reason that I have not had a tomato from my garden in 5 years. Because every time I go out, I plant tomatoes. I'm super excited. The tomatoes grow, they swell up, they are green, they are hopeful. And Kevin comes into my garden, he grabs a nice green tomato and he takes a big bite. And then Kevin recalls that he does not, in fact, like tomatoes. He leaves it with its tooth marks in it, right where I can see it on my porch, because he is a jerk. Then the next day, he does it again, and again, and again. This squirrel has taken a bite out of every single tomato in my garden for the last 5 years. And I've tried many things to get rid of him, including bird netting, metal netting, cayenne pepper, stray cats. I did, in fact, try stray cats.
One pest versus another.
I know. The 2 cats actually came inside, and we now have pets. But Kevin just ate cat food.
Maybe you need to bring Kevin inside.
Let's not. And I began to realize I hated this animal. But I would bring it up to my friends, and they would be like, oh, but you can't hurt him. He's a squirrel. He's perfect. He's sweet. And they would, take pictures of the squirrel. People feed squirrels deliberately. People set up obstacle courses that go viral on YouTube for these animals. And I realized that every animal could be a pest to someone. It just mattered in what ways. And so I wrote this book.
So I have never had a problem with squirrels, literally.
Yet.
They've never been a pest. No, until this morning when Kevin's girlfriend showed up in my attic. Never until today. I'm like getting dressed to come here for this event with Bethany, and there's literally a squirrel that had broken into my attic, had clawed through some stuff, had this giant nest, had leaves and crap all over the place, and that literally has never happened in my life until today.
I'm so proud.
I feel like I'm cursed. I feel like you're cursed.
It's possible. We actually did have one that got in my roof in one of the places that I rented because there were holes in the roof. There we go. We named her Big Bertha because she was so big, this squirrel. When she hit, like you'd think a squirrel would make a little thump noise. No, this was a whoop every time. The guy who caught her said it was the biggest squirrel she'd ever seen. I think he told me he took her to a farm upstate. I did not inquire.
Yeah, right.
Upstate.
Mike, at this point, I'm hoping that you have a good squirrel story. Or you can at least say that you like squirrels.
No, this is really interesting, actually, because I have been thinking about this a lot. Well, I live a little further outside of Raleigh, and my wife, my lovely wife, has pet goats, and she had some sunflower seeds for the goats, and they stayed in the trunk in her car for a long weekend.
Oh, no.
And by the end of the weekend, squirrels had chewed up through the underside of the bumper into the trunk and looted all of these, sunflower seeds for the goats. And so, yeah, that bumper was held together with duct tape for a substantial amount of time. But I've never actually thought of them as pests per se. But it is interesting that you're mentioning this tomato thing, because this is an idea that I've had for a while, is like, how much do urban squirrels actually consume garbage or our soft, fleshy fruits and resources, because they mostly eat acorns and stuff, and there's usually not a shortage of these oaks. We live in the city of oaks, right? So it is interesting to hear that they're eating other things than, they're kind
Birdseed.
Yeah.
They're eating a lot of birdseed.
Oh, that's true too. I just think of them as eating hard things and not soft things like tomatoes.
Well, that's why they didn't finish your tomatoes. They
Yeah.
just left them on our porch.
They were like, I thought this was a green nut, and I was wrong. What I found fascinating is that the squirrel always figured out. So one year I was like, all right, you know what? Nuclear option. I planted no tomatoes. I planted jalapeno peppers instead. And I was like, oh yeah. I had this vision of this
Revenge.
squirrel running away with tears streaming down its furry cheeks. Squirrels cannot weep, but I can dream. Anyway, he did not eat them. He never touched that jalapeno pepper, not a single one. Every single time I've grown hot peppers, he knows. Not a single one has a bite out of it.
Well, but this is kind of the more of your book, right? Is like sometimes humans need to change their behaviors instead of the animals. So you need to become a jalapeno farmer instead of a tomato farmer.
Actually, what I did was I learned things about the spatial memory of squirrels. And I learned that they have incredibly and highly accurate spatial memories. And so what you do is you have to set up your tomato cage over your tomatoes before the tomatoes emerge. If you wait until the tomatoes emerge, which I tried this. When the tomatoes emerged, I bought a large gardener's cage. I spent all morning setting it up. I was feeling real good about myself. I go off to my friend's house, and I get this text from my husband, could you please come home? And I'm like, why? And he sends this video. There are 2 squirrels that have gotten into the gardener's cage and are now bouncing around like furry ping pong balls because they can't get out. He had to let them out. 20 minutes later, they were back in. He let them out again. And yeah, so then it turned into a mighty anti-squirrel fortress involving chicken wire and the gardener's cage and bricks. But this year, gardener's cage needs to go up early because if squirrels do not taste the thing, they do not know it is there, and they will not come and get it. So the moral of the story is to learn about your squirrel behavior and set up your gardening cage very early.
So it sounds like part of the criteria for some critter being deemed a pest, at least, is they have to be able to outsmart us regularly. If we're at least, the whole squirrels thing is like, okay, they consistently get around whatever it is that we set up to stop them. Also, they consistently frustrate us because they can do those 2 things. And so it's like we get angry, and we try to stop them, but they are just able to get around us at every turn. Does that hold true for stuff that's like not squirrels, or is it particular to squirrels?
Yes, I actually ended up writing a lot about this in a section in which Roland is cited several times, because so much of what we call pests is about power, and it's about vulnerability. It's about animals that make us feel powerless, that make us feel scared. And these animals, once they make us feel powerless and scared, our fear turns to anger, our anger turns to hate. We turn to the dark side. And it's all downhill from there. And one of those animals that really exemplifies that is actually the coyote, which I ended up talking to Roland about. And coyotes have been spreading east for some time. And they're causing people issues. And I would love to hear your take on why coyotes are spreading where they are and why they're coming into more suburban environments on the East Coast in particular.
Sure. So coyotes were originally a western species. They lived in grasslands, deserts, open habitats in the western United States and Mexico and up into Canada. And then around the early 1900s, 1910, 1920, they started moving, expanding in all directions. And so if you think about the environment, like to the north, they moved into the great northern forests of Canada and up to Alaska. To the south, they moved south into the rainforest. So they weren't really forest species before, but as we fragment the forest, there's more farm fields. They can handle a little bit of forest. So they've moved now all the way to Panama. They're at the verge of entering South America. They haven't entered yet, as far as we know, but they're right at the edge. We've got some camera traps that have gotten them in the Darien rainforest. And then the East Coast was this great bit of forest that they never used to live in. Now it's fragmented. There's more fields as well as forest, and there's coyotes all over the place. And so as coyotes moved east, they colonized the better habitat for them first, which would have been the more fields and a little bit of forest. But eventually they moved into the deep forest, and eventually they filled that up and they started moving into cities because, a young coyote grows up, and if he goes into the nice park, he's going to get beat up by the other coyotes. And if he goes into the neighborhood, well, maybe he can scrape out a living there. And so they've been sort of slowly colonizing across the East Coast cities more and more. I think here in Raleigh, they kind of showed up in the county in like the 90s. And into the more cities only kind of recently, into the developed areas of Raleigh. And so they are just the ultimate in adaptability. They can eat fruit, they can eat insects, they can catch small prey, they can do okay with big prey. They're not really that good. They more often will scavenge roadkill. They'll eat some garbage, but usually not a lot, but sometimes a little bit. They'll eat certainly cats, even better, cat food. If you put out cat food, coyote's going to be quite attracted to that. And so they've come in, and in some ways it's probably because we got rid of the wolves, right? Wolves were considered a pest a couple hundred years ago, and so we killed almost all of them, and that kind of opened up the space for the coyote to expand. And coyotes have become a pest for some people in some places, but a lot of places not. And so I think it's interesting to see, like, a lot of places they're sort of filling in for the wolf ecologically. Not totally, definitely not completely. But rather they're a pest, sometimes we use the word invasive species, right? Like an invasive, so they are exotic in that they didn't used to be here. They're not introduced. Sometimes we use the word introduced because they weren't introduced. They got here on their own. We can see their spread. And whether they're invasive, whether they're a pest, is sort of, are they causing harm to humans, human societies, or to sort of other invasive, other native species, causing conservation problems? And there's some places where they do that, and there's a lot of places that they don't. So on average, they're not that big of a pest, I think, but where they are a pest, they're one of the bigger, sort of scarier, toothier pests out there.
It's really fascinating to me how many of the people who I interviewed for the book who had like personal interactions with pests, right? They'd be facing, you always hear this, oh my goodness, I had a rat, it was the size of a cat. No, it wasn't. I am sorry, it was not. There has been no recorded wild brown Norway rat that has been over 2 pounds. I know a guy, the rodentologist Bobby Corrigan, he carries around a check in his wallet. He showed it to me for $500 for the first person who can hand him a 2-pound rat, and he has never used that check. Okay, you tell me that rat is the size of a cat, that's a kitten.
Mike, is there anything in the research collection we can make $500 off of?
Probably not.
Different species of rat.
Yeah,
Different species. It's not
I got
Rattus
a Gambian
norvegicus.
pouched rat.
Those are big. Those are
Yeah,
big guys.
They're so substantial.
But it's just really interesting when we have an interaction that makes us feel powerless and that makes us feel scared. All of a sudden, the animal grows in our minds and it becomes huge, right? The raccoon becomes the size of a large dog. The coyote is the size of a wolf. It's not.
Well, coyotes do look big, right?
They do.
They are
They're floofy.
in true, they're very lean. And people always compare it with their dogs because people know how much their dogs weigh, and many people have like a 50-pound dog. I have a 50-pound dog, and they see a coyote and they're like, "It was the size of my dog. It was 50 pounds." And I understand that. I have a 50-pound dog, and I've seen coyotes, and I would approximate their weight to be about the size of my dog. But the truth is, coyotes very rarely can get to 50 pounds. But on average, in the East Coast, they're like 35 pounds. And in the West Coast, they're even smaller. They're like 25 pounds. So they're on the West Coast, on average, they're half the size of my dog. It's just they're so lean and fluffy. And
lanky. They're tall.
Lanky.
They're lanky.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing is there's actually been, if you hear them howl, it sounds like a huge pack. Oh, there must have been 10 or 15 of them. And there's actually a paper on this where they experimentally played people different numbers of coyotes howling, and people consistently always overestimate it. It's almost like the coyotes, it's probably part of the evolution of their howl, right? They want their howls to sound like a bigger group. And so the way that they do it makes it sound like a bigger group, and people fall for it all the time.
Oh my goodness, I did not know that. That's amazing. How did I miss this paper?
I don't know. Had to be in Pests Part 2.
No, it was very funny when I was reporting on coyotes in California. One of my sources was super happy. He was like, I'm going to show you the coyotes in Golden Gate Park. It's going to be great. No, not Golden Gate. We were in Hollywood. So he's like, I'm going to show you it's going to be great. And we're there and we're waiting and the coyotes come out. I'm like, that's it? He's like, excuse me? I'm like, well, they're so small. Our coyotes are much bigger than that. And he got all mad at me. But I actually saw a road-killed coyote outside of Washington, D.C. the other day, and I was so excited I almost pulled over. Like, this is who you become.
Well, and so the reason that eastern coyotes are larger is that before, as they were moving east, they actually hybridized with wolves. And they've got some wolf genes mixed in, and then they also hybridized with dogs as they moved east. So they've got some dog genes mixed in. So on average, the sort of eastern coyote, it's still like 80 to 90% coyote, 80 to 90% coyote, but it's got 5 to 8% of dog genes and 5 to 8% of wolf genes, and they're all mixed in. And it's a great experiment in evolution, right? Because if those genes help it survive, then they're going to survive better and they're pass those genes on. And we've actually shown that some of the wolf genes that we're pretty sure, we don't know exactly what they do, but from the dog genome, we have a pretty decent idea that they're associated with growth and bone growth and muscle growth, that those genes are surviving better and helping coyotes survive better and being passed on. And so that's part of why eastern coyotes are sort of 35 to 45 pounds, whereas western coyotes are like 25 to 35 pounds.
I just love the idea of imagining like an expanding coyote's Tinder profile. So he's like, I just match with anybody. It's like, poodle, labradoodle, golden shepherd, German shepherd. Fine, I'll take the poodle. Just
Well, that's how we think it happens, actually, is that, right, the first coyote that got into North Carolina, springtime came along, she had no one else to breed with, no other coyotes were there because she was the first one. And they're pretty dedicated breeders, and so they got to take the next best thing they can get.
Oh man, I'm just waiting for the dachshund, the coyote dachshund hybrid.
Well, that's actually where coyotes.
Can we? Yes.
Can we not?
What would you call that?
A dachyote?
Coyote.
A coyote.
Well, this is part of where. So when do coyotes become pests? When do they become invasive and cause problems? One of the situations is attacking dogs, and we've been actually surveying. If you look in like, I have a Google News alert. Anytime coyotes make the news, which is pretty much every single day. And a lot of times it's because they attack dogs. And they're almost always small dogs. And it's often like someone lets their dog out and it doesn't, to go to the bathroom at night, doesn't come back. But sometimes, there was just a video the other day of this, I felt terrible for it. It's an old lady in L.A. walking her Chihuahua on the leash. And the coyote comes up and yanks it off the leash, and it's not breeding with it. We think it might be aggressive. I don't think they're eating them. I don't know. We don't really know. But the small dogs and coyotes are not a good mix.
I've taken to calling Chihuahuas walking coyote Snickers.
Yep.
Coyotes, Snickers.
Snickers.
Oh my
Yep.
goodness. Oh my goodness.
When they're hangry.
Oh yes.
Are alligators considered pests?
Certainly, Floridians do not enjoy them. I personally maintain that if the alligator is eating you, you are moving too slow. Have you considered moving faster? But no, alligators routinely kill people and dogs. And I think it's really interesting how we are sometimes more tolerant of that when it's happening in places that we deem to be wilderness. So it's happening somewhere like the Everglades. Well, that's the wilderness. Brown bears, for example, kill about 1 to 2 people a year. They're big. They're very big. And if they don't want you to be there, they will find a way to make you leave by whatever means necessary. And we're kind of okay with that, right? Like it's a charismatic megafauna, right? And they went out there in the wilderness, and people don't realize, I think, that there's no such thing as wilderness. There's no such thing as a place that should have no people in it. A place that is for animals and a place that is for humans, right? Every place that we live, we form our own ecology. And some of these animals are going to take advantage of that ecology.
The mention of Florida puts me in mind of animals like pythons in Florida. Like there's apparently a lot in Florida that we could talk about. A lot of animals that are considered pests, perhaps. gators maybe, but there's also non-native species like pythons.
Tegus.
Tegus.
I don't even know what a tegu is.
Yeah, Argentinian lizard, big lizard. From
Not
the
to mention
Penn
the giant African land snail,
Yeah,
And the monkeys.
the monkeys.
capybaras.
Florida has more invasive species, exotic, introduced species, free living than anywhere else, I think.
Florida,
States.
I think Florida is the Australia of the United States. Yeah.
And so are all of these then, if we take sort of the definitions you've been giving for pests, are the monkeys in Florida a pest? Are the tegus a pest? Or are they non-native? They can survive there, but they're not, like you mentioned, Roland, are they doing harm? Or what harm are they doing, and what's the threshold for a python or a tegu?
Yeah, so I think, some of these species are fairly benign. Tons of anoles, small geckos, things like that. It's unclear if they play any kind of role other than prey for bigger things. But when you're dealing with the tegus, the Burmese pythons, there are breeding populations of boa constrictors, anacondas, Nile monitors. There's not really very many, as we see from the work with the Burmese pythons. Burmese pythons are gigantic snakes, and yet they're cryptic enough that somehow they were, mass populating the Everglades before anyone noticed for a couple decades.
We have no choice but to stand.
Right, and so I think that, their impact is unequivocal in terms of there's basically no more mammals left. I'm the mammal guy, right? There's no more mammals left to even study in parts of the Everglades because the pythons have literally consumed them all. And they can just sit there. The beauty of being a python is you have such a slow metabolism that you could last 500 days without eating if you've got the fat reserves. And so they could just sit and wait for new prey to eventually migrate in or move in or repopulate. But they are also shifting their diets, right? So we see them, where I work in the Florida Keys, in Key Largo is an endangered island ecosystem. And so now we're studying their impacts on the endangered rodents there, the endemic Key Largo wood rat and Key Largo cottonmouse. And compared to the Everglades, we're only just now seeing the prevalence of the pythons increasing, and we're effectively at the front end of that invasion curve where the population's growing, that we're hoping to be able to manage it and contain it and prevent that, extinction events of these endangered rodents. And we're lucky that we observed it early enough in this case, but that's an easy system to work in because it's contained. But I think that, the northern invasion front of the pythons, there's not really anything stopping them. Cars, right? They get hit by cars, and the state of Florida has python roundups. But if you look at the data, these roundups are removing, a couple hundred pythons a year. There are contractors looking for them. We're the folks out there are throwing everything that they possibly can at just not removing pythons, at just figuring out a way to find the pythons in order to remove them. But that northern invasion front, it's slowly expanding northward. And if you look at the climate models of like their suitable niche space in the climate, what they can withstand, they can make it all the way up into North Carolina, and that's without any kind of warming. And
Keep
so
your eyes open.
Right, and so it's a slow, steady slithering front there, but we need to be monitoring and managing at that front. And so part of my work in the Keys that we talked about in the book was trying to mitigate these things at the southern invasion front, and hopefully we're learning something for that northern one.
So I actually kind of wanted to follow up on that because, interestingly, Burmese pythons are threatened in their native range. They're from Southeast Asia. They are threatened by habitat loss in particular in their native range. Why aren't we pleased that they're actually doing well in Florida? Like, they came to Florida, and, you know, shouldn't we be happy? You know, there are other, well, not happy, but content. I mean, you know, there are other species that if they made it anywhere, we'd be absolutely cheering, right? But we're not. And what I found really fascinating is, you know, your own work with Burmese pythons is to save a rat and a mouse, which, don't get me wrong,
special rat and mouse.
they are extremely cute. It is not their fault.
Are we trading one pest for another?
But it's just really interesting because those are animals that you would otherwise consider, some people might consider pests, right?
Sure, yeah.
And a snake that is threatened in its home range that is succeeding elsewhere.
Right. I think this is an interesting kind of moral, ethical question, teetering on that edge, where, yeah, it's really unfortunate that Burmese pythons are threatened, endangered in their native range, and you know, in a perfect world, we could start collecting them in Florida and shipping them back and reintroducing them, right?
I did ask a scientist why we couldn't try that.
Right, but they've been breeding in the Everglades and presumably adapting hyper specifically to that environment and shifting to a largely aquatic ecosystem, largely aquatic diet. They've shifted their diets. Who knows what their genetic potential is, because it's unclear. They were founded by a small population of released pets, and then who knows what kind of diseases that they've been exposed to in their invasive range, and that they could potentially bring back and basically wipe out the native range or something like that. I think this brings, we have plenty of other species that are more common in their invasive ranges. Camels in the outback, right, are they basically don't exist anymore in the wild, and they're pretty, well, I don't know that they're abundant, but they exist throughout the outback.
They're pretty abundant.
Right.
Yeah.
Pablo Escobar's hippos, how about those?
Hippos, hippos, camels, horses.
Yep, horses,
Yep.
yeah.
All the wild Mustangs of the plains are not wild. No. Pigeons. They're succeeding wildly. There is only one known colony of wild pigeons left in the world, off the coast of Israel. Yeah, there's another colony that's debatable on the north coast of Scotland. I don't believe it. Sorry, Will, if he's watching.
And so what's the rat connection to the pythons? Like you said, there are some parts of the Everglades where there's just no mammals. I know that you've studied specific species of rats in Florida. Mm-hmm. Is there some connection between, like, the field work you've been doing and the rats that you study?
Yeah, the connection is the cats.
Oh, yes.
It's cats.
The connection is cats.
Well,
Twist, okay.
Working in South Florida has its charms, and I effectively work in an interconnected web of pests, because I study these endangered rodents, the key larga wood rat,
which are not pests.
Which are not pests.
They're
ecosystem engineers.
Cute.
They're doing all kinds of important seed dispersal and ecosystem functions. They're great. They live in the forest. They're not coming out into people's homes. They're doing their thing.
They build giant, cool nests.
Yeah,
like these big old.
I showed you some.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, this high. But then we have the non-native black rats, the invasive black rats. We have had a long-running history with feral and free-roaming cats, domestic cats, as an issue, consuming these endangered rodents. And then now we have the pythons, and actually we have coyotes too. So it's all the pest
Recently
players.
invading coyotes.
Yeah, recently invading. They
But
had to come over 18 miles of bridges and berms to get to the keys.
Oh, please, Night's Walk. They got this.
It's true.
But you actually, we talked about this. You actually successfully managed the cat population of Key Largo.
Well, I didn't do it,
You
but I've been able
persuaded
to
people.
document some of it and follow along. And it's been fun working there. You know, I've been working there for 10 years now, decade. Feels like it's time to move on to something else, I guess. But
Everybody loves Florida. Come on.
no, but you know, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been working in the community there to mitigate the impacts of feral and free-roaming cats, live trapping them, and you know, working in the community to remind people that responsible pet ownership is ultimately the way to mitigate these issues with
Right,
pests.
but what's the one factor that led to more responsible pet ownership than anything else?
Coyotes and Burmese pythons.
Right, the common enemy. All of a sudden, they wanted the help of the biologist.
And how exactly are they doing that?
How exactly?
How are they helping the biologists?
Oh, well, you know, we get support from the community because they're interested in this common enemy, the Burmese pythons, right?
So it's because
Burmese
the pythons and the coyotes were eating the cats.
Yeah, pythons are absolutely consuming cats there. I mean, they consume any mammals that they can find and subjugate. But anecdotally, this is a little bit of scientific gossip here, but we find a lot more fat reserves in the pythons that we find around where, you know, the urban edges where there are more cats in the environment.
Right.
I mean, presumably the raccoons and opossums also have higher fat reserves in places where they're feeding cats, so they could be accumulating in multiple pathways to get those
Cats
fat
are the
deposits.
McDonald's of the...
Yeah.
I love this so much.
Well, I mean, if you're putting out cat food, right, you're setting it out. Of course, you're going to be attracting the cats that are going to come there, and then the raccoons and the coyotes and the possums and the skunks.
Well, and the rats.
And
the
the
rats.
rats, right? So, but you're basically making this giant concentration of mammal biomass. And so when a cold-blooded animal comes along, sticking its tongue out, trying to find where the warm-blooded mammals are, they're going to go there.
And you can just sit and wait.
Yeah, that's one of the things I found really fascinating reporting this book, is how many people want to feed things. They want to feed animals specifically. They want to have, I call it the Disney princess moment of the bird landing on your hand. You know, they want to have the deer eat out of your hand, and they don't. They want to feed birds. They want to feed, you know, cats. They want whatever, and they only want that one. They put out a dish of food, and they honestly believe that only the one species they want is going to eat it. When, like, if you leave a box of cookies out on the counter and you have a family, do you honestly expect that box of Oreos to be untouched when you come back? No, of course not. Like, you may have intended it for you, but your dog had other ideas.
Right, and I think it's super interesting how, like, it's generally, like, the smaller the critter and the less pest-like they are, right? So birds, yeah, feed the birds. Oh, the hummingbirds, like, what could be, like, more sort of
Pure.
Pure, right? Than feeding a hummingbird, the smallest of the critters, right? And then, okay, other birds, like, that's kind of fine. But, you know, if someone starts feeding the raccoons, you're like, oh, you probably shouldn't feed the raccoons. Right? The foxes. Someone's feeding the coyotes. Hey, wait a second, you should be feeding the coyotes. Someone's feeding the black bears.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wait a second. Like as you get bigger, that like all of a sudden, like, oh, so why is it okay to feed the hummingbirds but not the black bears? And I think it's, you know, it's because their potential to be a pest and to be a serious pest. You know, like, has a hummingbird ever been a pest?
Not that I know of, but I'm
so.
sure give it time. I believe in them. They are small but mighty. No, I was thinking about this because in my reporting, in Massachusetts, I was working with this bear biologist, and he had this huge issue. There was a dude in Western Massachusetts who insisted on feeding the bears. And he had a big old platform set up in his backyard, and the bears...
And a YouTube channel?
Probably TikTok, to be honest.
Yeah.
But the bears would come every day, and he put out crazy amounts of food, and he would not stop feeding the bears. He would not stop, even though the bear biologist came to him and said, hey, in an effort to get to your food, there are bears getting killed on the highway outside this neighborhood because they are trying to get to where you're feeding them. And he's like, well, that's none of my business. I just want to feed the bears.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, well, but I also think it's this habituation and external resources that are creating the pests, right? And so that's again, individual mismanagement of resources in terms of, intentional food supplementation. But there's plenty of other simple things like securing trash and other things like that to prevent animals from getting into the messes that they can create. But putting the stuff there is not, what drives it. It's the habituation and the acceptance until all of a sudden it's no longer acceptable, right? It's like
everybody wants photos until the animal gets
and
too
then all
close.
of a sudden it's too much. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Everybody seems to want the photos until it's too much. And that's one of the things I was kind of looking into is the fact that humans, we have this idea, and by we, I mean Western, mostly white, kind of groups, have this idea that we dominate the environment, we deserve to have only the animals that we want be there, right? And we refuse to change our own behavior when those animals cause problems, right? If the animal is getting into our trash, it is not we who should lock up the trash, it is we who should poison the animal. There's actually another solution to this. And it's really interesting because I found that this is a very Western view, or global north, or, and not everyone thinks this way. There are other groups who will say, okay, we need to change our own behavior. We need to recognize that these animals are here and we live with them, and we need to live with them responsibly. And I thought, that's something we could all probably learn from, honestly. In other news, please lock up your trash.
Well, I think it's also interesting in your book how you talk about there are situations where just a few people can create a pest, and the pigeons are the one example where, like, if there are pigeon feeders that are feeding the pigeons, and the whole population in the city might be dependent on a couple people that are doing it for their own personal reasons. And I think we see the same thing with cats sometimes, where it's almost like a hoarder kind of, like animal hoarder kind of situation.
And that was actually really interesting because one of the things that I found about pests is that they can be a problem of social justice, because many of the people who I talked to who studied actually the social science of pigeon feeding, there are people in this world who study this. God bless academia.
Like a PhD
I love you.
in that?
Yes. His name is Colin Jarelmack. He's at NYU, wrote a whole book on it, loved it. Fantastic. A+ research, very good. Anyway.
Should have known it'd be in New York.
Of course. But he talked to people who fed pigeons, and he actually looked at why they did. They were lonely. Many of these people were elderly. They were alone. They had nothing. They had no friends. What else are they going to do? It is a harmless thing to feed the birds, and the birds are grateful, and the birds are friendly. Birds in New York City are so tame, you can literally reach down and pick one up. I have done it. So you do understand why, but then you also start to understand this is a social justice issue, right? Like, we could help people who are elderly and socially isolated be less socially isolated. We could give them a community. People who feed cats are often very socially isolated. We could take care of that. People who live with rats do so because they have no choice and they are living in poverty and with homes that are not impervious to rodents. We could fix those problems, right? Animals that become pests are often becoming pests because our social contracts have failed. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we look at an animal and be like, ugh, rat with wings.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's quite powerful.
Thanks. It's in the book.
Or just like to put it together, just before we got to the social contract part, we were talking about how there's some threshold we eventually get to with an animal, and then it becomes a pest. And we go from being okay with it to then vilifying it to being okay and then blaming that thing because we can't look at ourselves. It's not our fault. It has to be something else's fault. And that extends to our neighbors as well sometimes. That it's all of a sudden the problem, it's not our problem anymore. We're going to blame some other person, some other type of person, or some other behavior
Yeah, absolutely. That absolutely happens, especially with rats. And people, some of the reporting I did was actually in homeless encampments, where people are living with concentrations of rats that were excessive. It was a lot. And they did not want that. I mean, first of all, they don't want to be homeless. We'll start there. But they also really don't want to live with rats. They did not want to live in an environment that was dirty. You could actually see, places where they were like organizing and keeping spaces clean. They were doing their best. It was the social contract that had failed them. It was a society that had decided that they did not deserve clean housing and to be free of living with animals. I think that's a really important thing to think about.
Bethany, thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get dark.
No, I think that's a fantastic place to maybe see what if there's anyone who's here in the theater with us that has any thoughts or questions they'd like to share, you can just wave at me. I'll actually come down and bring you a microphone. But I think it's a great spot to leave it as a reflection, right? That's a good moment.
Well, while you run down there, can Mike tell the story of the python in his pants?
Oh my gosh.
Please. It's so
You're supposed to leave that for a secret.
but it's so
You'll have to read chapter 2 of Pests.
Everybody pick
It was
up.
such a good story.
December 2007, I guess. I in a former life before curatorial duties here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, I was a zookeeper at the Palm Beach Zoo in 2007. And I went backcountry camping in the Everglades by myself. And it was right after Hurricane Wilma. A lot of the trails hadn't been cleared. And I needed a permit to go backcountry camping or whatever. And I went solo, and it was an 11 or 12 mile hike, and I was, 6 or 7 miles in, and I found this Burmese python, like this beautiful snake. And I looked at it and admired it along the trail and stuff, and I was like, wow, that's wild, because it doesn't belong here.
Right, so this was before it was kind of well known.
Yeah, 2007 was like really early on
Yeah.
in this, before they really knew a lot about them.
So you knew you had to catch it.
I started walking. I kept going, and then I was like, "Wait a second! I gotta catch this thing." And so I turned back, and I didn't really have a plan, and I just grabbed it by the tail. And I grew up in the era of the Steve Irwin days, right? And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I had no actual plan. I had it by the tail. I took my shirt off. I threw my shirt over the head because, a simple fact is that if you cover an animal's eyes, they'll be easy to capture. And so I grabbed it by the head.
Also,
and then,
Burmese pythons
and then its
have
body
crazy
wrapped,
teeth.
and then its body wrapped all around me, right? And so then I was hopped up on adrenaline at that point. And I was like, okay, now what, And this was, I don't know, I'm sure, like the coyotes and everything, I'll elaborate. It was probably 13 feet, this snake. I think I said it was smaller in the book.
No, you said it was 13 feet, and then you looked up the email evidence, and it was 8.
But anyway.
It was great. It was great.
Probably
it felt
25 feet.
Like the strength of a 13-foot Burmese
50 feet if it was
python.
an inch.
Anyway, a long story short, I'm an Eagle Scout. I am resourceful. I took my pants off, my jeans.
One-handed.
One-handed, and I tied the legs of each of them with my teeth, and then I slowly unraveled the snake and stuffed it into my pants, and put a bungee cord through the belt loop and cinched it shut, and threw the snake in my pants, in my backpack. And I slept with it in my tent with me that night. And then on the way out the next morning, I saw 3 additional Burmese pythons. So I was like, holy smokes, this must be a way bigger deal than anyone realizes. And when I got back to check out for my backcountry permit, I said, hey, does...
You walked up in your underwear?
I walked out, I said, are people finding Burmese pythons in the Everglades? And the woman that I had to check out with the permit or whatever, she's like, boy, I got a better question. where are your pants? And I said, they're right over there on the sidewalk, and there's a python in them. And anyway, that's kind of.
I'm so proud of you.
Yeah, it was before the days of camera phones and everything. I have zero documentation of that, other than the National Park Service actually came, collected that snake. This was early on in the research, and they put a transmitter in it and re-released it as part of their initial studying the behavior of Burmese pythons.
You sent an email to a friend in which you described the encounter.
Yeah.
And then you sent it to me because of fact checking.
And then, it was like, the snake grows every year since 2007. So, anyway.
Thank you.
And now I'm back in the Florida Keys studying pythons again. Can't escape the pests.
I'm glad we got that story. I'm going to have you tell that story a lot.
Bethany, looking at the cover of your book, I was trying to understand the range. Like the pests that are the biggest pests in my life are insects, and I didn't know what you limited. At first I saw only mammals, including what looks like a squirrel, perhaps your squirrel.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah,
But now we've talked about reptiles and birds. Is that the full, how did you decide what to cover and not cover as pests?
Yeah, so the book is actually only vertebrates. Certainly, every time you talk about pests, I have a list as long as my arm, even of vertebrates that did not make it. There are so many: seagulls, crows, wild hogs, tegus, giant land snails. I mean, there's just so many. I ended up actually focusing on vertebrates for a reason, because this was about the subjective nature of pests. Because the reality is, even if it's a pest on an agricultural crop that we value, that is still a subjective judgment. But you can't really get people to make an emotional connection to an aphid or a roach. It just doesn't, it's hard. Snakes are hard enough. So I ended up focusing on vertebrates because I really wanted people to feel the tension and to feel the subjectiveness of the definition, and to kind of realize that these are definitions that we impose on the animals and don't have anything to do with the animals themselves, right? No animal, invertebrate, insect, or otherwise, is deliberately going out to cause us trouble. They're merely taking advantage of opportunities that we provide.
Yeah.
So I know that with insects, and I don't know if this is also true with vertebrates, that if an insect is classified as a pest, then that changes the way that it's regulated and, legal things around. I mean, is that true also with vertebrates? And then how does a pest get classified as a pest in that regard, in terms of like how it's going to be dealt with in public policy or regulatory kind of way?
I'm throwing that one to Roland. Do you know that?
Oh, geez, I was going to throw it to you.
Well, I only know that in Australia.
Yeah.
I
So
was thinking about the rabbits in Australia.
Yes.
So generally with the vertebrates, sort of what you're allowed to do to an animal is dependent on the game agency, right? They're going to regulate when you can hunt deer, what the seasons are, what the ways that you can hunt them, and they're going to have classified different species according to that. And so that gets most interesting, I think, in some of these areas when it comes to feral hogs, because sometimes if they classify them as a game species, that's different than if they classify them as more of a pest. And so if they're a pest, then they'll open up more, anytime, open season, no bag limit, more liberal in terms of what types of methods you can use to harvest them. And so generally speaking, with vertebrates, invasive species are usually you can do whatever you want because they're invasive, open season. But it's not quite the same with agriculture because most of the vertebrates don't get classified the same way that invertebrates do. You do have often, when it gets a little interesting is when you have something like a deer that's become a agricultural pest. Then do you have the have to follow the rules of the hunting, or do you get special pest rules? And so they do have special pest rules. You need to sort of apply and tell the state what the problem is, but usually it's pretty easy to get permission for a farmer to go shoot deer out of season kind of as much as they want if they're causing problems. Maybe Mike wants to elaborate some on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of what in line with what I had in mind. I think that there's no like legal classification of pests as vertebrates as pests, as far as I understand. I'm not sure about that. But yeah, in terms of like feral hogs in the state of North Carolina, there's no harvest regulate. It's an open season. I think the important thing is that there are rules and regulations about how humane the death has to be, because there's not, you can't just throw bombs at them or plant mines or anything like that.
Or poisons. You have to watch out with the poisons, because that can harm lots of other species.
Also, leg hold traps and snare traps are differently regulated.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for sure. Depending on the species and everything. What is actually interesting in line with that is that part of my work in the Florida Keys started as a follow-up to their integrated pest management plan. And the pest management plan includes removing all invasive species, including things like feral cats. And that is where a lot of controversy stems from, because people have a hard time accepting that animals that can be our pets, whether they're cats or feral dogs or Burmese pythons or tegus, can also be invasive, deadly, destructive predators in the ecosystems. But what I find most fascinating about that is, as part of the work I've been doing with pythons, we were tracking them and finding pythons because they were consuming some of the prey animals in our research most recently. So I've been fielding a lot of emails from people
like me.
but suggesting, folks from the general public, they have all kinds of ideas about, putting poison pills on the collars of these raccoons and opossums, or little detonators that as soon as a python consumes them, they blow up, or spikes that just like expand out as soon as they hit the stomach acid of a python. And it's fascinating because people celebrate the killing of pythons. They're like, everyone's excited about like these python derbies, like kill all the pythons. There are some coyote derbies too, in places, and yet a lot of other species, feral and free roaming cats, that are just as destructive in the environment, are kind of, it's like we look past that because they're cute, or because we associate them with being our pets and not invasive predators. And so I think that there's a lot of humanization, and that the gradient that pests fall on, probably correlates with that, humanization of them, like broadly with the public, how much we kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, align with them, or
anthropomorphize?
Yeah, anthropomorphize,
I think that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is that we will do a great deal to protect the animals we value, to the point that we will do really awful things to the animals we don't, because we value another animal more. And I think about this a lot with regard to, for example, island ecosystems. You will have rats or mice that end up on islands, usually because of us, and there's like a population of seabirds, and it's like this last population of these 100 seabirds or whatever. And people will drop millions of tons of poison on those islands to get rid of those rats. They totally will, and they will celebrate. At the end, they're like, yes, we did it, we got rid of the rats. If it is a cat, all of a sudden...
Or even rabbits.
Yeah. You can't... Have you considered rehoming it? Have you considered, taking it somewhere and adopting it? Right? What is the difference? And it also made me ask the question, I don't know if there's a good answer to this. I've talked to many ethicists, and none of them agree, as is traditional with ethicists. And I've asked them, like, what is the right decision, and why are some of these animals more valuable, right? The reality is that the rats are killable because they are pests. They are killable because they are common. But why is it bad to be more common? Why do we privilege the rare? You know, why is biodiversity considered an inherent good? That's not to say I don't think that, because I do think that. Biodiversity is great, but it is also a judgment that we've made. And it's kind of one that we have to live with the consequences with, which is kind of sad. Anyway, in Australia, you can shoot a cat whenever you want, by the way, because they're pests there. Or a rabbit, yep. BYO shotgun.
I don't know if you'll have an answer to this one. I kind of want to, all this Python talk has made me realize there's an elephant on your book, and no one in the United States would ever consider an elephant as a pest, but I can clearly imagine a situation in other places where they are. But what I have personal experience with is living in Austin, Texas, where a very large colony of bats lives in a man-made structure in the heart of the city, and goes south to Mexico for the winters, but always comes back. And are they considered, I mean, the population sort of, people would gather around and watch them come out at sunset, and
I believe that is a tourist attraction. That is a tourist attraction.
So they became a tourist attraction, and it's called Bat City. And interesting fact, the actor who played Eddie Munster lived in Austin, Texas also, and weirdly. But yeah, so are bats, is one of those flying things on your book a bat? Are they
They are not. I actually ended up avoiding bats in part because of COVID. It was a little sensitive at the time. Because some species of bats are really interesting. Keep an eye on this space regarding bats. So bats are really interesting, but they're also very interesting in that most of the time people don't go out to trap and poison bats, right? If they are killed, they are often killed in retaliation for things like disease outbreaks. So no, the bats are not, but the elephants are. Yeah, I got to study elephants in Kenya. I studied African elephants, and I met some up close, and they're beautiful. They are so smart. They are so sweet. They kill 200 people a year in East Africa and cause millions of dollars in crop damage.
I sort of was thinking earlier, as we were talking about the squirrel example as a pest, that they're sort of the funny pest.
Yeah.
It's like lots of people have relationships with them, and lots of people are annoyed with them as a pest, but it's like, oh, he ate your tomatoes. That's funny. You can call him a funny name. But then there's the elephants and some of the other species in your book that have like
wolves,
much more consequential pests. I feel like we need another gradation of pests. We need two different words, like minor pest, funny pest, and not so funny pest.
If you look at the work of Philip Nihus, he has published a really interesting article on this topic in 2016, where he actually kind of classified animals into like 8 cubes of human judgment, which I adore. So basically it's a 3-dimensional kind of cube situation wherein your x-axis is how common the encounter is. Your y-axis is like how severe the encounter is. And like the middle axis is like how positive or negative it is, right? Those could be different axes. It's hard to remember a 3-dimensional. Yeah. I don't manipulate objects in my head very well. But it's very interesting because we think of animals where consequences are rare, very severe, and negative. Those are predators. So like brown bears, sharks, things like that. Very rare, very negative. That doesn't turn out well. But then you have encounters that kind of goes on a gradation where you have encounters that are less severe but more common. So most of the time when people have negative encounters with elephants, it's because they're eating their entire crop for the season, not because they are killing. If they kill, it is by accident, usually. There have been a couple of cases that are not by accident. Elephants are smart. And then most of the animals that we think of as pests, mice, rats, pigeons, geese, Canada geese, yeah. The interactions are extremely common, extremely mild, and only slightly negative, right? Like people really hate goose poop. What I find really fascinating about that is like every group of Canada geese you see on like a golf course or a lawn, we brought them there because we thought they were picturesque. And they stayed. And now we're mad. I love that for us. It kind of makes me happy.
Let's give our guests one more round of applause. Thank you so much, Bethany. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for being here. I also want to extend a special thank you to the folks at Quail Ridge Books who have copies of Pests available for sale out in the lobby, and maybe Dr. Brookshire will stick around and sign your copy if you pick one up.
I might could.
Might could.
I'm from here.
Yeah. I also want to say thank you to North Carolina State University's Genetic Engineering and Society Center for bringing Dr. Brookshire to Raleigh and for offering your time up while you're visiting with us so that we could have what turned out to be just an awesome, fun, and good conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Roland and Mike, for being such amazing conversationalists. And thank you, Chris, for being an amazing interlocutor.
This was fun. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out to the Museum of Natural Sciences. Travel safe, be well. We'll see you next time. Good night.